As you've heard earlier this hour from the Prime Minister Scott Morrison just announcing the details of this Royal Commission, our political editor Andrew Clennell was there asking me a few questions. He joins me now from Sydney. Andrew, what did you make of the announcement? Look, I thought he probably tread a reasonably good line saying, of course, we're acknowledging climate change, but he doesn't want this to be a proxy about the target. I thought he handled that probably pretty well. What did you think?
Yeah, well, what we've got here, Tom, is what looks like a $25 million Royal Commission, which I suspect will largely justify some of Scott Morrison's positions since the fires on the south coast and in Mallacoota. So the terms of reference he's revealed basically go to hazard reduction and keeping the states accountable on that. And he made particular mention of the situation where he could call a national state of emergency, which goes to the dispute in early January with New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian about sending in the reservists. Now, what the Prime Minister obviously wants is an ability to call a national state of emergency so the federal government can have involvement and not have to wait for permission or request from the states. I think we kind of know the outcome of what's going to happen here before we have the $25 million inquiry, Tom, but the Prime Minister suggested I was cynical putting that to him.
Well, look, the clear thing about this, if you look at the terms of reference, is there's a real will to focus on the future. And we need to know what to do in the next bushfire season, absolutely. But a lot of people want to know to what extent as well the warnings were coming for him and things could have been known ahead of this fire season. I know there were other questions asked, for example, about the warnings from the former fire chiefs about this season.
Yes, and I don't think they will be called. There was a question to that effect, but I think you only see current fire chiefs there. Interestingly, I asked the PM if he'd be prepared to give evidence. He looked a bit surprised or taken aback by that, but I would have thought if you were looking at that dispute with New South Wales and whether there should be a national state of emergency, the PM could detail his role in that situation and when he wanted to bring in the ADF and it wasn't able to happen. So you could see that. You could see Gladys Berejiklian, you certainly could see Shane Fitzsimmons. And I think there's an expectation at the federal level that there could be some embarrassing revelations here for the state government of New South Wales in particular, Tom. Particularly stories I've heard about towns or villages of about 50 people who hadn't seen a soul before they saw the ADF come in with some food and fuel and that sort of thing. So I think these are the sort of stories we're going to see out of the Royal Commission. I think the Prime Minister's right to say that a lot of Australians would like to see more federal government and Defence Force involvement, not with fighting the fires themselves, but with dealing with the emergency as such and the ability to call a national state of emergency.
Well, in particular, when you saw people being told to evacuate and then petrol either not available, Andrew, or only available with cash, which we basically live in a cashless society right now. So that sort of role for the Army, as you say, it's not necessarily trying to douse the flames, but it can be for people fleeing those flames.
Yeah, and the PM made that clear. He actually said that the Defence Force wouldn't be in a position to douse the flames, but they would be in a position to get in there and help the communities who are really struggling on the ground, don't have enough food, don't have enough fuel. That happened on the south coast of New South Wales. I think New South Wales, the Royal Fire Service who were advising the Premier, was so focused on obviously fighting the fire and the fire emergency that some people got left behind there. I mean, there's certainly been the case, certainly some talk that in terms of the evacuation warnings, New South Wales did well, and there could have been a lot more deaths. The Premier's said that. But it's some of these other issues, and really, I feel a justification of Morrison and his position against Berejiklian that will make up part of this.
Andrew, all this talk of the government, meanwhile, and their possible net zero 2050 emissions target, now Labor's gone and pulled the trigger on it itself. What can you tell us about this?
Well, I can tell you that I've just discovered that it was actually in January when Shadow Cabinet agreed to this target, and they've delayed the announcement of it, which Anthony Albanese will make tomorrow, partly because they thought the government were doing a good enough job fighting themselves that they wanted some oxygen for the announcement. So you had the Nationals leadership spill and all those issues. So the announcement's been delayed a couple of months. Interestingly, Anthony Albanese hinted at this when I spoke to him in January. Let's listen to a bit of that if we can. So 45% now.
It doesn't end well.
45% now by 2030 is too ambitious. That's what you're really saying.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying we'll determine our policy. It will be as ambitious as possible. You know what, Andrew? I want to have a very strong framework. I want to be ambitious and I want it to be as strong as possible. But you've got to know what your starting point is.
So at the time he talked about a longer-term target, Tom. He didn't rule out zero net emissions by 2050. Scott Morrison really looks like he has been putting himself in a position where he is going to rule that out. So we're going to have a replay at the election of the last election in terms of one side going to the left on climate change and one side not so left. That's what we're going to see. I think that we will see a situation where the Prime Minister uses this to wedge Labor. He's commissioned a report by Energy Minister Angus Taylor to look at what that would cost in terms of jobs, etc. And he won't be adopting that policy, I don't think. Albanese is going to announce Labor will tomorrow.
Yeah, look, it might give them the scope if they have a report saying here's how we get to, I mean, they're saying they won't put a target on it at all. It's just a technology roadmap. Perhaps they will now look at targets because they can say here's what 100 will cost, 100% as in net zero, and here's what perhaps 80 will cost. It will be interesting because there is the IPCC saying this is what we need to get to, so it's a bit different to the way 2030 played out. It was an arbitrary 45. We know why they're going for net zero this time, but right of the Labor Party, some of them already concerned that this might have been a decision made too quickly, Andrew, given we've got so long before the election where they could have waited for the government to make a decision and then made one off the back of it.
And after that interview with Albanese in January, Tom, I thought that was the plan, to be honest, to wait to see what the government did first. A lot of people would see that as politically smart. On the other side of the equation, Albanese's been criticised for having no policy. So I guess he gets a tick for that. I mean, he will say that he's only adopting the target state Liberal governments have adopted, but I don't think that will make any difference in the overarching political argument on it. Apparently it went through Shadow Cabinet unanimously, but there's concern from Shadow Ministers about how they get to the target, how they illustrate they get to the target, and whether the government can pick holes in that.
Yeah, interesting hearing that unanimous. You'd imagine there was some debate, even if all the hands went up at the same time at the end of it. Andrew Clennell, thank you. We'll talk again next hour. Interesting revelations there.